Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. Uh, this is episode 29, Measurement, Generations of Artificial Mechanisms. It's basically my next piece in a series of ruminations regarding my work and my ideas relative to my work as a kind of a theorist and researcher in architecture. And we started this back in December of 2024 and worked our way to where we are now. So basically, can I give a overview here? We have started with the idea of the operation of the metaphor, which is a kind of like essential piece as relates to my work. I remember coming across the idea of the metaphor within the work of Ortega Gasset, and he talked about the idea of generation as a generational strategy. So I was kind of interested in that. And then this was when I was a young professor in the 80s, mid to late 1980s. And then from there, kind of like over the years, kind of started to kind of piece together to the point where I realized that I actually see the operation of the metaphor as a process by which intricacy and complexity comes from simplicity, and started to think about ideas of entanglement and generation. Anyway, so I started with that, and that was the first talk, and that was the first rumination. This was a series of videos that I had done based on a series of essays I had written prior that was going to be a project. And then that basically kind of like worked its way into this second iteration. So from there, we talked about the idea of the artificial or aesthetic metaphor, which is something that we kind of understand as that is the kind of common idea of like metaphors. We understand it in art and literature. And I talked about what I call the unbreakable bonds, or the proto-metaphor, which is something I see as a kind of social entity. Then from there, I talked about some things about necessity of criticism, art of finding what needs to be said, review of criticism. Then I talked about architecture as a verb, which I now would say is a process, and then drawing, and then towards an organic architecture, which is what I do. And that was the first series. And then after that, there was the authority of ideas, and that kind of started to kind of deal with the idea of how I started to see my own kind of particular kind of development. Work that talked about that for a while, then went into my generation as coming to understand myself as an architect, in school as a student and as a professor, and then the aftermath. Then we talked about the idea of indicators of societal health, as I realized that the unbreakable bond actually has a kind of like relationship back to, as a part of the metaphor, to indicate certain relationships to societal health. Went through a series of other lectures and kind of came to pretty much where we are now. Talked about the importance of unbreakable bonds, and then talked about force, power, rule, and persuasion, which is something I'm going to talk in a couple of weeks about, what I call as honesty as it relates to discourse, which I think is a kind of important thing in our time. Then recently, the last couple was about about relationships to my own particular work, and I kind of break it down into two specific things, one of which I call entanglement and conditioning, which is the organic and deals with organism in relationship to my aspirations as an organic architecture. And we talked about that. And then today, what I'm going to talk about is something that's kind of like what it grows out of, which is what I call measurement, which is something that relates specifically to my work previous, that kind of like was the things that relate to the things that came before. So, as is the case, let us now talk about this week in Julie. So we will kind of discover what's going on in the work in the world of Julie. So Julie will kind of come and kind of tell us what she's been up to, and then we will kind of go from there. So Julie, are we ready?
We are ready.
Okay.
Yes, we are.
All right.
Coming now.
Okay, so next week, let's see. Next week, we're going to talk about the nature of perspective within the metaphor. Oh, that's going to be fun. Good, I like that. That's gonna be good. Okay, so.
I'll bring my chair.
All right, good. So what's going on this week in Julie?
Well, yesterday I started my drawing, which is actually, I never use the word sketch because I think it trivializes drawing, actually. It's a drawing for my next painting. If anyone tuned in last week, they will know that I finished the painting, Janus Tales of Abisu, which was on the duality of the Kupfer cell. So I finished that, and it's always hard for me to be in between paintings. I need to live in a world I create because the one that we're all trapped in now really blows. So I need to get to another painting as soon as physically possible. So the next painting, it's actually a very interesting story. It was inspired by, oh, thanks. Okay.
There's never a time that's bad for orange juice.
No, true. Would you like a straw?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
Oh.
It was inspired by a piece I've always found quite enchanting in a surreal, kind of creepy way, which is in the German decorative arts galleries, there's a lot of Meissen porcelain. And anyone who's familiar with the work of Meissen Porcelain, a German porcelain factory, did very experimental and surreal and whimsical teapots and figurines, but really wild with an Orientalist flair. They were very exotic. They were very fanciful. They were very magical. And there's one life-size white porcelain sculpture called Baron Schmiedel. His real name isn't that, and he was not a baron. He was a court jester. And I think King Augustus, I'll check it out. But he was a court jester and is dressed in finery, but it's a borrowed life, meaning that the finery and the layers of velvet and lace and gold buttons and his tricorn hat, it's all at the whim of the king. And in fact, he had a partner, and one of their jokes, the king obviously didn't have a real sense of humor, backfired, and the king threw his partner in prison. And he was going to have him either stay there and rot or execute him. And his partner managed to escape. They pulled a big prank, and the king found that funny, and he got back into the good graces of a very fickle king, which is to go without saying that the idle rich are fickle because they don't do anything or create anything or invent anything. They just judge everybody. And they are quite tyrannical, as this king was. So Schmiedel was always in fear of being imprisoned or being executed or being exiled. And his particular, I mean, he actually, even I did my own research because at the Met, the wall text, it's actually in a standalone case. The text on the case, while having some information, didn't actually have the most pertinent and fascinating information, which is he had a pathological fear of rodents. He hated them. And it would appear that these are 4 trained mice who were his friends and his pets. They were neither his friends nor his pets. He was kind
Nor
of,
am I.
or yours, or Bruce's, or
Nor am I their pets.
You're not their pets either.
No,
So
not in the least.
So in fact, yes. So in fact, he was forced to do basically a dog and pony show, but a man and mouse show
With mouse.
with mice, and mice that he had a dread fear of. And the what, Bruce?
Oh, I wanted to backtrack because I kind of was looking for an opportunity to kind of
Sure. I
interject
didn't
about
know.
something
I thought you wanted
that
me
you're.
to-
No, I know, but
sure.
there was something you raised which I thought was
Oh.
very interesting. You talked about the fact that things kind of deteriorated
Meh.
now, which is something that I've been speaking about. Is that
Mhm.
the conditions by which
Mhm.
one intervenes in or one engages in work,
Mhm.
right, is always with the expectation that there's something in the work that has a consequence that's meaningful,
Mhm.
rather than just kind of like trying to kind of like, kind of cook a mangy dog, in order to kind of like survive.
Yeah.
So exactly.
Yeah.
So given that
Mhm.
realization, or that kind of like supposition,
Mhm.
what would you say, given your time as a student, say to now, where you see the kind of like horizon of consequence of the potential for work? Meaning like, like I talked previously about the fact that when I kind of was a boy growing up in the World's Fair, in the Shadow
Mhm.
World's Fair, like you did,
Yeah.
we thought about the fact that we would be adventurers in deep space and kind of
We
like be
certainly did.
at this point kind of somewhere, kind of like, with a 115-year lifespan, kind of jettisoning
At
to
the
the
low
horizon.
end, yeah.
Exactly. So I mean, we would be, kind of like at this point in our lives, kind of young to kind of approaching middle age,
Yeah.
and seeing the fact that we would be
We had
assuming
vast and magical expectations.
exactly.
I
So
think.
okay.
Yeah.
So then looking at the fact that the
Mhm.
the realization of the expectation relative to what it is now,
Mhm.
how do you see this as the conditional reality for at what point work becomes useless?
Which work? Our work? My
Yeah, I
work?
mean the work. I mean, because again, we talked about the fact that if we're in this kind of like post-apocalyptic
Oh, well,
nightmare.
Obviously, we can't do anything.
No. But I'm saying
until-
what are the conditions that you see as pertains to our situation at the moment?
I don't know. It's very hard.
Fun
to
question,
focus.
right?
No, it's not really. That was
Right.
not all what I was.
No, but I
talking
just
about.
kind of found that like that was
Yeah.
something that's been thought.
Yeah, I really
doing
have to
thoughtings
think
of it.
about
Okay.
that. But I mean, I do find it, and I will say on that topic, and I usually do not have trouble finding focus with anything, but it's incredibly hard to focus on my
Mhm.
drawing, on my painting, on my writing. I've barely written anything because the world is a horrifying, creepy, scary cake of dynamite. So,
Mhm.
yeah, it's really, really hard to focus.
Good times.
Hard to sleep. Yeah, but I wasn't.
No, I just thought because it pertains to some of the things I was going to say specifically to this thing. So
okay.
anyway, so Baron Schneidel, and in fact, what was interesting, we
Schneidel.
had the Schneidel. Okay. So we was talking about the fact that you were kind of like you'd started the drawing, and now you're kind of looking at the fact that you're going to develop into a larger format.
Yeah.
And then you had the kind of like the fact that there's two sets of mice, because if I
hadn't
remember
gotten into
correctly,
that, so.
yeah, that the group of mice have come to understand that their plight is connected to this individual, but they really don't trust him because he's somewhat of a buffoon, and as a result, they
And he
realize
also hates them.
exactly. But at the
They
same
don't like
time, they
him either.
realize that, and this pertains to the architecture we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks,
Yeah.
in terms of like the fact that certain domestications take place, and the fact that like say mice realize it's much better to be kind of like dealing with the finery of the interior world and just the buffoonery of humans, as opposed to being out in the wild with a much more feral circumstance.
Oh,
So
yeah,
they
would
actually
be
fight,
fucked up in a
right?
moment.
But
would
they
be-
fight for the idea of they fight for the ability to stay within this domesticated reality because it's favorable.
Well, yeah.
So
I
that, yeah.
mean, a mouse is literally food for everybody. And in the wild, they would be eaten. They would be eaten by any one of a number,
Mhm.
anything from a loose house cat to a wild animal
Mhm.
to, I mean, they would have a very short life in the wild.
Mm-hmm.
And when they are part of his dog and pony act, they also live in a palace,
Mm-hmm.
and they have possibly the longest lifespan of any mouse on the planet, because they are kept in a state away from the predators, even though they're part of this absurd act.
Right.
So what I was saying is, there's a lot to show in the painting, and there will be an observation deck, a viewing platform, as a second set of these 4 mice, just in a different state. It's the same 4 mice will be, in fact, looking inside the mind of Baron Schmiedel, who was simply, given the title of a baron as a farcical kind of a gesture. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
have a title. I mean, he wasn't part of the rich. He would never be accepted. He was basically, a clown for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And inside, and this is the last thing I was going to say, inside his head is going to be a grotto of terrifying wild nature.
Mm.
A screech owl's nest being devoured by a snake. And all those things that are in the dark of the forest are going to be spilling out of him, and almost like a cornucopia of fear.
Mm.
And so that will be part of the painting. So we're going to have to add on a lot of paper,
Right.
because the drawing pad is only 9 by 12 inches.
Mm-hmm. Right. But we basically can kind of like graft it into a piece
Sure.
of 18 by 24 and then cut it back to
Mhm.
the kind of size that it's going to be. So that's kind of
Mhm.
reasonable. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So what is coming up? So we're basically that's this week in Julie.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I
Yeah,
have a
just-
painting to show too on the topic.
Say.
But why don't you say a little bit more about the topic
Okay.
of measurements?
All right.
Because I did pick a painting.
Okay. Okay. So
But
measurements.
I don't want to, just
Measurements kind of ties back to earlier pieces of my work before I actually found the work that we talked about the last couple of weeks in terms of the organic idea of approaching what I would call organism, which is something that is a series of processes towards an interconnection of processes as a result of just a collection of pieces. And, the idea that there's a trajectory and a kind of stability from which you can kind of judge that thing. We kind of distinguish between an organism and a mechanism, in the fact that an organism is something that basically has to be maintained and isn't something that kind of ever reaches a kind of set of stasis, whereas and it basically is something that has a series of projected processional process related kind of like trajectories, as opposed to a mechanism, which is a collection of things that may have a particular operation, but can basically be in a state of, I guess, suspended animation. I mean, when we think of life being suspended, we think of it as kind of suspended animation, almost in a kind of estivation, or kind of like where it slows, but it never stops. Operations of mechanisms kind of stop all the time. They simply go to a position of rest. So what happens is, once I found that kind of desire for the pieces that I would say aspire to organism, there's still that remnant of my earlier work that I still kind of engage in, which deals with this idea of measurement. Now, measurement in the sense of two things that I think are pertinent. One is a piece that Whitehead talks about, that kind of, when he quotes Poincaré in Adventures of Ideas, where he says, Poincaré points out that instruments of precision used unseasonably may hinder the advance of science. For example, if Newton's imagination had been dominated by the errors in Kepler's laws, as disclosed by modern observation, the world might still be waiting for the law of gravitation. The truth must be seasonable. Now, what he means by that, I believe, is the fact that one has to have a kind of reasonable understanding of the circumstance by which one engages in understanding the principles of observation, so that you overcome the bias that can kind of lead you to error. And some of those errors can become catastrophic and even diabolical. And that also kind of leads me to something that I've kind of believed for a long time, which is that is kind of embodied in the first section of the third book of Hume's treatise on human nature, where he talks about the idea that there's a difference between, and a kind of suspicion in the kind of project of skepticism that deals with the idea of the correlation between, and the kind of concern one has to show between a descriptive idea and a prescriptive idea. The Treatise of Human Nature, which I think is probably the greatest book of philosophy ever written, and again was written by an individual who was a public intellectual at a time when public intellectual was much more a deeply kind of considered thing than it is today.
And the public knew what an intellectual was.
Yeah, true. I mean, there are people who would kind of fit the term today, a public intellectual, but they certainly wouldn't have the consequence. You know, I mean, you know, the Treatise of Human Nature is one of is a seminal book within the canon of kind of like, you know, of Western philosophy, and certainly deserves to be there.
Sure.
But it's broken up into three pieces: the understanding, the passions, and and morals. And what Hume does is he basically kind of argues for, this is in the first book about how understanding takes place if possible. And in the second book, he talks about the passions, which are those things that drive us. And in the third part, he talks about of morals, or the relationship of the judgments that we make in terms of understanding how we aspire. And he talks about the fact that reason is a valuable consequence, but in itself is not a motivator. We don't desire from reason. We can use reason to temper, but it's not the thing from which we aspire. One, you know, in fact, it's sad because, I mean, you know, growing up in the world of like Star Trek, and by Star Trek I mean the James Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Scotty Star Trek. I mean, not this kind of like the other ones, you know, that were not really Star Trek. But the idea that the Vulcans kind of like elevated themselves by logic, you know, logic again and reason are not a desire. They're not a passion. They're basically a temperament. They're basically something that one.
Quark in Deep Space Nine.
Okay. You're very pretty.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I think, you know, we do is we kind of mislead ourselves by believing that we're rational people, and we're not rational people. We're impassioned individuals, and our impassioned nature basically can be tempered and kind of like facilitated, but it's not driven by reason or logic. But anyway, in that case, what happens is, and this is the other thing, is that there's a break between a descriptive and a prescriptive, so that one can't say because of this, therefore that. And the piece that I always found was best in terms of demonstrating that was the fact that since morals therefore have an influence, right? What Hume says at the end of section 1 in book 3, I cannot forbear adding to these reasonings of an observation which may perhaps be found in some importance. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning and establishes the being of a God, or makes observations concerning human affairs. When of a sudden, I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations or proposition is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an not. The change is imperceptible, but is, however, of the last consequence, for this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation. 'Tis necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable. How this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it. But as authors do not commonly use this prescription, right, or precaution, I will presume to recommend it to the readers and am persuaded that this small attention would subvert all the vulgar systems of morality and let us see that the distinction of vice and virtue is not founded merely on the relations of objects, nor is perceived by reason. That's a lot to digest, but what it's basically saying is reason does not lead us to conclusions, right? This is something that has a completely different set of circumstances, and it's much more intricate, much more complex, much more nuanced. So the idea is we have found, so measurement, I find, has a very specific kind of quality, but at the same time is not as tangible to conclude as we often assume. So we kind of like, that's why this idea, and it's also talked about by Whitehead in that earlier piece that I read, is that we have come to this thing, and when you kind of look back on things like eugenics and other things where the kind of measure of individuals, physical individuals, has led us to some horrifying conclusions and actions, we need to be more circumspect.
Well, speaking of eugenics, you might want to know that the quad, I went to the bathroom, is showing a film on eugenics right now called The Last Twins. And it was about the Nazi experimentation on Jewish twins. And it looks really rough.
Okay.
Really rough. But for anyone who's up for a really rough experience, that would be it. I'm not sure I can handle something like that right now.
Well, you see, well, that's just it. I mean, I think, I remember when I did Mr. Stickhead, what was interesting about Mr. Stickhead was the fact that, like, I had created this circumstance where I kind of created this impression of someone who was drowning and hanging at the same time from a twig. But the point was that there was also these kind of like drawings that I had made that kind of rendered, that kind of like had this sense of measurement, as if one could abstract an individual or a character into a series of tangible dimensions.
That's what Joseph Mengele did.
So a lot of people did. A lot of people still do.
Yeah.
I mean, what happens is this.
That's why I brought that up.
No, it's true. But I mean, for me,
they measured everything and they tortured them. And
right. But the idea was the fact that one could use this not in the way in which we assume, which is that it's a kind of like, oh, look, we have gained a certain understanding because we've been able to kind of create this data set or this fact sheet or these numerological kind of things. But the reality is often the opposite happens, right? Because there is this concern that Whitehead brings up in terms of his work about, his work on civilization, by pointing out the relationship to Poincaré's statement, and as well as what Hume's talking about, in the fact that this project of skepticism, as expressed in Hume, is such that you must be wary of this desire that people have to kind of jump to conclusions. So measurement is kind of in those pieces, in the fact that there's always kind of some sense of weighing or kind of holding or measuring in such a way that becomes kind of very ominous, overbearing, and kind of like can be in certain pieces. It's kind of like, just this kind of like a light melancholy. In other places, it's kind of quite kind of overbearing and kind of terrifying. So that's basically that particular that aspect of the work. So based on that, like what was your question?
Something very specific to a show.
Okay.
I think that types of measurement often are and can be quite intentionally, sometimes by accident, misappropriated, misconstrued, misinterpreted. And that is what I want to talk about. And that's my painting.
Exactly.
That I want
because
to show.
Sometimes it's done intentionally with a kind of nefarious intent. Other times it's done with good intentions. And it's interesting because, like, you talk about eugenics. One of the
Yeah.
one of the great centers of eugenics during that period was at Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island, with a lot of the top scientists, some of which were the same people that were surrounding the Crick and Watson, who were kind of this of previous and kind of similar generations, who came to the kind of like discovery of like the double helix. So I mean, both Crick and Watson basically, were aware of the Cold Spring Harbor, and both, I think, spend time there as researchers.
Should I
Yeah.
bring my painting up and talk about it?
Yeah,
or-
because I want to talk about this idea,
Okay.
because it's very ominous, but it kind of has a kind of subtlety that you don't realize how we get from these we get to conclusions without really justifying them, but we always kind of say, well, 7 and 12 and 13 and elasticity and blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
Okay. So I always felt that the Hume's project of skepticism was something of tremendous importance, because it showed the kind of a kind of pomposity of thinking and reasoning. I mean, I'm not going to say I'm not anti-reason. I'm just kind of highly skeptical of conclusions. And I think that there's a tremendous benefit, especially in the way that we kind of find what I would say a utility. And I'd say that, like, if one kind of, makes a map and it allows one to travel and be able to kind of discover certain points that allow you to kind of reference, this is a utility. But I think the unfortunate reality is that morality is still elusive in spite of this. Oh, I love this piece. Oh, I love this piece. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, God, this is so beautiful.
Well, it's on really thick paper too.
Yes, it
It
is.
was all we could get at the time. It does absorb more color, so
It does.
it's not as colorful.
Okay,
as
so
some of
explain this to anyone.
Okay, so read the title, which
Okay.
is over there.
Gastrulation of Eric Satie, composing tensegrities of parasol mycology.
Lots of measurement there in the tensegrities, in the gastrulation, in Satie and his own personal life and philosophies, his compositions. For those of you who are unfamiliar,
Tell us what gastrulation is.
what?
Tell us what gastrulation is.
I think you should explain it.
I don't know what gastrulation is.
I'll find a good definition of it.
Okay.
Hang on. I want to get the best definition of it. Hang on. You can show it. I'll be right back.
Okay. So the project of skepticism brings about this idea of, for me, the need to be wary and suspicious of the conclusions. Not that the conclusions aren't consequential or can't be consequential, but there's a necessity to be circumspect.
I wanted to get the specifics of it.
Ah.
So it's a biological term on development of a simple spherical embryonic structure of an entity that then develops in a process called gastrulation into a multi-layered, multi-celled, more complex organism. So it's a developmental biological process, like the work of Eric Satie. This is the development of his work from a simpler form into a much more layered and complex form.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, because it's been a while since I looked at this, because
Yeah.
this piece was done in 2020, so this is
Yeah.
kind of 5 years old.
Yeah.
Was that Satie had become this kind of almost as if he's kind of this spider-like character who's
it's a
kind
really
of
great painting.
weaving these kind of mechanisms that, you see these, like, these incredibly metallic kind of stringed instruments, and you referred to kind of tensegrity as in Buckminster Fuller, and the
And
fact
that's
that he
exactly,
creates
yeah.
this delicate balance as he kind of moves through his motions to kind of like of his life, but at the same time kind of gives up this kind of sporulation of this kind of mycological kind of reality that's kind of coming about as a result of the kind of complexity that he's kind of manifesting. And you see him almost as if like he has
I think you might
become,
want it.
he has become
Yeah.
he has become the process, by which, and the mechanisms, and he's also become the instruments, right? But I think you talked about the fact that he had actually created instruments himself.
Well, that's where I get into the measurement, and that's why he is in this painting building and composing his own imagined and fully functional instrument that is vastly different from compositions of his age. And that's what I'm going to get into. Is his was an age of symphonic composition. He composed a few symphonic works that are not his forte. Almost all of his works that he composed were for the piano solo, piano works for the keyboard. He composed on the piano. They were for the piano. They were not chamber pieces. They were certainly not symphonic pieces. The way Satie measured time was vastly different from the popular way that people felt musical time in that age. And that is my point. The time that Satie measured and manifested in his compositions, and I urge people to go on YouTube and look for his Naciens, his gymnopédies. Those are the two. They're otherworldly. They're futuristic. He actually has a piece written about the sea cucumber. I mean, these pieces sound like they were composed by an underwater creature. I mean, if a cephalopod wrote and composed sounds, it would sound like the work of Satie. And what is key here is there was in his day an absolute distaste for the kind of simplified, pared down musical time that Satie espoused almost entirely to the exclusion. He did not include stringed instruments. He did some orchestral works, and I do have a recording of actually everything he did, and I don't think they're anywhere near as successful. They feel very forced. There are only a few of them. They're extremely awkward. His compositions on the piano are otherworldly. They are brilliant. They are intense. They're quirky. It's a kind of invented time that was not understood in its age. And most importantly, on the measurements of time being misconstrued, here goes. He experimented tremendously with wind and water. He measured wind and water as part of his experiments for his work. And here is how people misconstrued it. When he died and they pushed open or broke into his apartment, he lived alone, which is that he fell in love with Suzanne Valentin, if I remember correctly, who was a painter in her own right, and a good one, and an artist model. And she did not return his love and affection. Oh, you might want to give everyone the dates. That's a great idea.
Like 1866 to 1925.
Yep.
So it's interesting. So basically, he's coming with the great age of physics. So he's come, let's see, 1859 is The Origin of Species by Darwin. So he's born after that.
Yeah. He was around when Sigmund Freud was.
Right. He basically was around, so we're understanding the psychology of the unconscious.
Yeah.
And he basically dies 10 years after the discovery of general relativity. So he's basically, okay. Okay, so he's 34,
But he was-
39 years old when
yeah.
Einstein writes his five
And
great
he
papers.
was around for Art Nouveau.
Mm-hmm. 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 Right. So
And
he
the
basically kind of
Victorian
like,
age,
and just prior to the Depression.
yeah.
Okay, so this is a
Mhm.
very, very complex, intricate time.
Yes,
but I
it
mean,
is.
a lot of things have changed in terms of the origin of species and the idea of the unconscious. So I mean, I think those were two, to me, very significant discoveries. The idea of the mutability of species,
Mhm.
and the idea of the kind of like the desires and the passions, and the reality of the unconscious. And this was something that kind of like had a tremendous impact on music and art.
Oh,
and
it did.
science,
Oh, let me
everything.
just say like
Yeah.
really, really fast.
Mhm.
So here's how Satie's measurement of and quantification of certain aspects of natural time were utterly misconstrued.
Mm.
So when he died, and I'm guessing they broke into his apartment, they found the piano he composed on.
Mhm.
On top of his piano was another piano upside down, which surprised the hell out of everybody.
Mhm.
And in the piano, as I've read, were 50 some odd umbrellas. That's right, umbrellas. So naturally, people misconstrued that is he was bat crap crazy, that he was just out of his mind. And yes, he was a very eccentric character, self-professed. In fact, he actually drew. He made some really compelling drawings. He actually wrote about his work. He drew, and he was a very eccentric guy. He was a Dickensian character. He wore a tie. He basically looked like I've made him in my painting. Quite a bedraggled fellow who skulked around and had a very, very low self-esteem, unfortunately, who did not think he was the brilliant composer he's thought of as now by people in the know. But my theory is, not that he was not very, very eccentric, but he was measuring air, he was measuring water. He was, in fact, experimenting with the way rain hit umbrellas, the way wind could be modulated. Because if you listen to his compositions, it's throughout everything he composed. It sounds like wind and water. I mean, that's the thing. The other thing, why there are sporulating mushrooms on his back, this is the last thing I'll say, is they're called Parasola or Oricoma. And in terms of time, they have one of the shortest life cycles of anything, 2 to 3 hours. They sprout up on his back, and the way he described time in his music is that the notes hung in the air for a very short time and vanished, just like the mushrooms.
Yeah, because I think there's a
There's
historical or a cultural component to measurement as well. Because the thing is, we now have a lot of understanding or alleged understanding of the kind of prominence or kind of compelling nature of certain people. Satie, like Van Gogh, is one of these people who kind of like had this kind of trajectory that kind of almost missed his entire lifespan. I mean, we know about Van Gogh. Van Gogh was basically someone who we didn't understand his significance, even though it was clear that the measurement of greatness, of genius, was certainly discernible within his lifetime, but didn't come within his lifetime. In the case of Satie, most people
recognized,
right? And it's always interesting when you kind of like, we know of prominent work in retrospect, but the thing is, a lot of times we say like, oh, this wasn't recognized within its time, it wasn't understood within its time. In the case of Van Gogh, that's probably the clearest example. Now, the best example is the individual who was greater than Van Gogh, who we don't know about, who will never know. And I mean, what's interesting is, there are these people who don't get that history itself doesn't understand or appreciates its own measurement, in the fact that there's always the people who are prominent within their time but then disappear. Everyone who knows music knows Satie. People love Satie, but in fact,
in his time,
he was this kind of
figure.
someone who And
He was
it's
blasted by the critics. They hated him.
Mhm.
I mean,
right. So the
Yeah.
point is, like, even within that category, there's a measurement within time itself, which often can be incredibly inaccurate to the point where people end up kind of taking their own life, only to kind of like later to have history correct itself.
Yeah.
So, if that, and in fact, there's a positive aspect of that, is the fact that a lot of times, when you speak to younger artists or younger musicians, there's a sense of kind of like desperation or kind of like resignation. And you kind of say, like, you do your work for yourself, you do your work for the work's sake. And regardless of what happens, the best thing is that you get meaning and satisfaction from the work itself.
Yeah.
And that sustains you enough to worry about the fact that how it's measured in time is not of anything that you have to kind of take any consequence of. But I mean, Satie is certainly one of those individuals who was never recognized properly. And I think sometimes the complexity and intricacy, as was the case with Satie and also was the case with Van Gogh, can sometimes be beyond that understanding. In fact, what's interesting is people know of Whitehead. I mean, and I always find as if like we still are seeing Whitehead kind of the same way that we're seeing Einstein, in the fact that there are certainly people within the theoretical physics and mathematics who kind of see the significance of Einstein, but we're still kind of like, there's understanding the ideas that he's left behind, but then there's kind of still this like idea of the fact that it's amazing that this person was capable of this kind of, this kind of like flight of imagination and kind of like insight. So we still don't understand how one comes to those kind of insights, but we kind of appreciate that they do. And we live in between those individuals. Like when we knew of Einstein, he was a fairly insignificant character, but when we did not know of Einstein, he was an incredibly significant character. But I mean, if you explain that to people, it's kind of hard to believe, because when he developed his kind of like rock star status, he was no longer capable of generating the things that he had generated when he was unknown.
True.
When he was given away, when he was kind of like making his living as a patent clerk and giving away one free lesson for math tutoring, because that was how he supplemented his income.
Yeah.
But again, that's kind of one of those components. So anyway, this idea of measurement and the kind of put it in the context of what Hume talks about as the idea of understanding the relationship between its utility and its consequence and its potential error is something to be incredibly suspicious of. And we certainly have seen those things manifest themselves over time, some by nefarious intention, some by diabolical intention, some by good intention. But the reality is, I think it kind of makes us, at least me, have a sense of pause in the fact that anytime, especially in our kind of, media crazy, social media crazy reality, that someone makes a pronouncement or kind of like talks about something in terms of relationship to a data set or kind of set of, set of observations. And I'm like, okay, let's sit and wait and absorb this. Because I think one of the things that's also a crisis in science with the reproducibility issue is the fact that sometimes we can't even reproduce the findings. So they themselves are somewhat intangible. But to come to the conclusions that because of one study or one paper or one thing, that we can come to kind of make these leaps.
Oh yeah, that's not how real science works. It's never, based on one paper. People need to be able to prove it and duplicate
and
it.
I think
I
think scientists, for the most part, with the exception of some of the poor ones, understand that and are not so quick to rush to conclusions.
Yeah.
Science and art and philosophy are slow, laborious, kind of like consequential engagements that take place over decades, lifetimes, millennia. So I think the rush to conclusion is an impulse one has to kind of like put a certain maturity towards.
Right, but it's so prevalent in this incredibly impatient age.
Yeah, I think also what happens is people are looking for significance. I think, it's always a natural impulse to kind of look for meaning. I was having a discussion when I was at the Met today drawing, with these two young individuals. And we talked about the idea of certain aspirations, and I kind of mentioned the fact that we see many people with many noble aspirations, but at the same time, the noble aspirations don't seem to kind of match the desires and the intentions. They kind of seem as if like, someone's basically trying to tell you why they need to do something on your behalf, when in fact you come to understand it has nothing to do with you. You're just basically a tool. So that's why I think I try to capture that in some of the pieces that I call measurements. And what I'll do in the coming weeks is, like, when we start to go back and once we've absorbed these ideas, we'll kind of like do that. And I think this was a great illustration of the fact that Sati, and I mean what you've captured in this piece is this very kind of almost feral intensity, which actually, again, like as Hume says, we're not driven by reason, we're driven by our passions. And in this case, there was an obsession that Sati had in order to kind of understand certain consequence within the nature of sound and create these almost mechanized, organisms that kind of like sit somewhere between artificial and natural, and that they kind of like became these tensegrity structures that almost became like as if an animated spider web that kind of affixes itself in a kind of like a space, to kind of capture and generate these things. I mean, a lot of times we see the spider web as a kind of like last refuge of captured things, but in this case, this piece, this mechanism, mechanism or organism that Sati has generated actually gives forth, right, these sporulating pieces that will kind of again entangle themselves and kind of generate more. So maybe from these things there kind of comes a kind of complexity and an intricacy and a kind of self-generating kind of mechanism.
Thought it was the perfect piece for this.
No, it is, because here I'd say that my work in terms of measurement is more of a suspicion and a kind of like watchful skepticism of, hey, let's not jump to conclusions, and kind of try to create these kind of very kind of like disquieting pieces that will mechanize or kind of like articulate that sense of horror that can come from some of these things that we've seen happen in the past. And in this case, there's actually a hopefulness, because I mean, in terms of the piece that I see, there's this kind of fact that here was this individual who was capable of kind of generating compelling articulations and could do it consistently.
Yes,
and leave these as a legacy that we can kind of appreciate as aspiring to kind of the things that we look at. I mean, as it says on the wall, we live together in pursuit of that which we believe constitutes beauty. And certainly within the work of Sati, there's certainly beauty in the fact that he kind of allows us to kind of capture those things that are indeed sublime.
Yeah.
They're enchanting, they're enthralling, they're kind of captivating. I think captivating has a capacity to kind of understand the fact that not by touching someone, not by kind of rendering someone, kind of prostrate on the ground or tying someone up, without doing anything other than, say, drawing a line on a page or kind of taking a brush to a painting, or like, kind of creating a series of sounds, one can create that sense of captivating and compelling, that someone can be brought to tears, someone can be brought to kind of like revelation. These are the kind of things that beauty can do, that only beauty can do. And when you kind of see that, you kind of get an incredible sense of hopefulness. It's the kind of thing that you want to kind of have, you want to kind of remember, because that's the kind of thing that makes you feel as if there's a reason to continue for tomorrow, because you can not only share with it, but you have the hopefulness that it can generate and it can be generated, and that genius exists. Because I mean, again, genius is the only thing that gives us any hope. At least in my case, it's the only thing that gives me any hope. And if there's anything, I mean, that's why I kind of feel that in this case, the brilliance and the beauty of this piece,
Thank you.
kind of constitutes that sense of magnitude, that sense of kind of like hopefulness that things like this not only exist but can continue to exist, which was kind of that question of like, at what point do we feel as if that is no longer possible? And that's a real fear.
Well, yeah.
Because the thing is, there was a
Certainly
time,
is.
I mean, and again, in Adventures of Ideas, Whitehead talks about that. Were the things, were peace, love, beauty, and the other things that he mentioned, were they, truth, beauty, peace, and these ideas of kind of fine action, fine motion, were these kind of things that kind of came to constitute the fact that civilization was present, or were they the things that kind of basically said, from this civilization will rise? And again, given the craziness of the circumstance, there's more than ever the reason to kind of continue. So, any last words there? Big one.
Well, I think that even though it wasn't what we were, I mean, Sati lived through World War One.
Mm.
So, I mean, there were times of
Almost
pure
out of time.
annihilation. And I believe, I mean, he basically almost lived in a glass jar.
Mm.
He had no support, no friends. He was a reviled creature. And he had that kind of sense of time in a kind of a solitude that was really imposed on him, not really chosen. So his time was a very solitary time, and his measurement of life was dramatically different from those around him. That's what I want to say.
That's true. That's very true. I mean, would you say there's a kind of sense of a suffocation, or kind of like, suffocation, or kind of like claustrophobia?
Didn't have any champions when he was alive.
No. I think that's another thing, is that like sometimes there are people who are self-sustaining in terms of their own, arrogance or ego. I mean, I kind of think that I kind of like have this really great belief in myself that sometimes
you have a very strong ego.
As you said,
really
like
good.
No one loves me like I do.
No one loves you like you. Yes,
I know.
But Sati did not love himself like you love yourself.
No, it's true. And we kind of see that in relationship.
He had a much harder time.
We say that in relationship to Van Gogh. I mean, Van Gogh was like, I mean, it's a natural thing to doubt yourself, but at the same time, you kind of come to see that, like, hey, this has meaning and this has consequence, and I kind of like at least can self-sustain based on that. So, okay, all right. So this was good.
Great.
Yeah. So next week, we're talking about the nature of perspective within the metaphor. And I think what happens is, I'll talk a little bit about Ortega with his idea of perspectivism. And I guess like my own kind of belief in the fact that the Western idea of the development of perspective is kind of like an incredibly consequential aspect of what we do as artists. So until then, and again, we were like an hour early because I'm adjusting my schedule to a new circumstance.
Yes.
The realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain this. Thank you.
Thank you.